Ebolowa. Ebolowa is not a disease. Ebolowa is actually the capital of the South region in Cameroon. Emma and I had the privilege a few days ago of doing a survey of the town of Ebolowa. It may not be a disease, but Ebolowa does have an interesting history. The original word, Bulu word, for Ebolowa was Ebolowo, and it actually literally means a rotten chimpanzee. We had a really wonderful and neat opportunity earlier last week to visit a primate sanctuary near the South region, and we were able to see several enclosures with gorillas and monkeys and chimpanzees, and we actually saw an enclosure with more than 40 chimpanzees. It was really incredible. We got to take a little hike to see what the South region looks like. We saw incredible rainforests. We saw massive trees. We also saw some very rare trees like the blackwood ebony, and it was just a really neat opportunity. Ebolowa is located surrounded by large hills, but inside a rainforest. The whole area is a rainforest. In fact, logging is a huge part of the Ebolowa survival and society. It's an agricultural society as well. The average temperature there is about 80 degrees year-round. Quite pleasant, actually. We noticed when we were there that plantains are part of almost every meal. Everywhere we went, there were plantains served, and so that was kind of unique to us and our normal diet in the Northwest. Another very interesting part about the South region and Ebolowa, there's a large co-op in the town of Ebolowa for chocolate. As we surveyed recently, we've seen the cocoa pods, which contain the cocoa beans, and those cocoa beans are dried and ground, and they make cocoa, which then produces chocolate. Cameroon is the fourth largest producer of cocoa or chocolate in the world. And so the next time you eat a chocolate bar, there's a good possibility that that chocolate came from a cocoa pod here in Cameroon, and even more precisely from the Ebolowa area. So Ebolowa has a lot of interesting things to see. Its animals and its location, its forest, its cocoa, and so forth. It also has a famous municipal lake. That was quite interesting to see, people going out on boats and so forth. But those are not the most important part of Ebolowa. The most important part of Ebolowa is the people that live there. There are probably around 100,000 people living in Ebolowa. Even though Ebolowa is the regional capital of the South, it is the smallest populated region in Cameroon, and it has a very small capital. In fact, when we drove and surveyed, the first thing we did when we got there is we drove in a circle around the city of Ebolowa, and it took us about 10 minutes. That's how small the town is. I'm standing at one of the main roundabouts in the city of Ebolowa. We've been surveying around the town this morning. We've seen evidence of liberal churches, a lot of Pentecostal churches, Jehovah's Witness. We've not seen any mosques yet. We're going to keep our eyes open for that, do some more interviews as we've done this morning. But we've seen a great need for the gospel here in Ebolowa. So we are convinced, even though we weren't able to communicate with many people, we tried to do some interviews and so forth, but to find people who speak English was not easy. And so we are convinced that from what we saw, there's a great need for laborers preaching the gospel in Ebolowa. We produced this video to kind of give you some ideas of some of the interesting things in Ebolowa. But as I said, the most important thing about Ebolowa is the need for the gospel because of the people who live there. Lift up your eyes, look on the fields, for they are white unto harvest. And when he gave them the solution, Jesus said, "Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he would send forth laborers into his harvest." And that's why we're doing these site surveys of these regional capitals in Cameroon. We are convinced that there's a great need, and we are convinced that God desires to see the people of Ebolowa saved and glorifying him. And so we'd like to ask you to do what Jesus asked us to do. Pray. Pray that God would send forth laborers into the needy town of Ebolowa and the needy region of the south in Cameroon.